Today, it's our great privilege to share the history of Maltese architecture. But it's much more than a collection of dates and styles. In this episode, we share the island's treasures, as seen through the eyes of architect Richard England. Long regarded as one of Malta's most innovative and influential architects, his passion for the art form is mesmerizing. And his views are deeply heartfelt, speaking to the soul and spirit of each piece. It's a real treat, and we hope you enjoy.
Malta, in a way, represents a midpoint between north and south and east and west. And almost all civilizations which have passed through the Mediterranean have left a mark, either etched, carved, or built in the one sole building material which we have on the island. It's a globigerina limestone. It has been used from the very first settlers, and the very first settlers were in fact a group of people who came over from Sicily, from the Stentin era, and over 1,500 years they developed an architecture which was completely indigenous and completely unique to the islands of Malta, and those were the Neolithic temples. They predate the pyramids. They are amongst the most amazing architectural and engineering episodes in the whole history of architecture. We have a people who learned they could husband the earth. Their deity was an earth goddess, but they also realized that the time to sow, the time to plant, the time to gather, depended on the movement of the heavenly bodies. So a lot of the temples on the sites in Malta, and there are quite a number, are actually dual sites. One is offered to the sky, like Hajar Eim, and the other is offered buried into the earth, like Imnidra. The hypogeum, which is completely rock-hewn, not built, but cut out of rock into the depths of the earth, more so to make a relationship with the Earth Mother, is an absolute must to visit. Hajar Eim was the only site which was almost untouched and exactly equivalent to the landscape into which the temple was inserted 5,000 years ago. That's about 3,500 BC. The fascinating thing is, these were a people who understood nature much more than we do today, regrettably, for us. For them, the land had more meaning, because not only did it provide food, they lived with nature, they understood nature. We today have a tendency to think that we dominate nature, but in fact, once you get any tsunami or any movement of the earth, we realize in fact how small and insignificant man is in relation to the giant of nature itself. So these were people who learned a lot about how to live at peace. For 2,500 years, we have found not one trace of a weapon. We know where they came from. Regrettably, we do not know where they went to or why they vanished from on the island. 2,500 years before Christ, the civilization just vanished. We don't know whether it was a lack of respect of the deity. We don't know whether it was a drought. We don't even know if it was an invasion by a warmongering people. What we do know, and there's a hiatus of a few years, is that years later, the Bronze Age people arrived, and they were a warmongering people. They didn't leave much in terms of architecture, but they left these fascinating cart ruts, which ran along the island, and some of them actually go straight into the sea. So we don't really know the reason or what, in fact, they were supposed to carry. If they did carry anything, we termed them cart ruts, but we don't even know if they were actually cart ruts. But then the history of architecture in Malta continues, and there's the Carthaginians, and then the Romans. The Romans left a few villas, especially the one close to Medina. Then there's the medieval period and the Arab period. Strangely enough, the Arabs were here for a few hundred years, and yet, in terms of architecture, left nothing. Then in the 16th century, Malta was handed over to the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem, and that creates a completely new era, an era so magnificent, because in a way Malta was like the Brussels of today. It was the center of Europe, and all the knights and the noblemen came to Malta, and of course they imported with them architects and artists. And after the victory of the knights over the Ottoman Empire and the Great Siege of 1565, the knights thought it necessary to build a new defensive city, the city of Valletta. Because, in a way, the victory over the Ottoman Empire and over Islam was considered by all European leaders as the one victory which stopped Islam from penetrating into Europe. Queen Elizabeth I sent money. The Pope sent money and also sent his architect, Francesco Laparelli, who not many people know was actually an assistant to Michelangelo in the construction of the dome at St. Peter's. But Laparelli came to Malta, and it is said that within 3 days, must have been a great architect, laid out the plan of the city of Valletta. Then the actual work was handed over to a Maltese architect, Girolamo Cassar. But it's interesting that in the codex which Laparelli wrote, and this is very pertinent to the way we think, or we don't think today, he had said that this is a city which is likely to be under siege for even a period of 6 months. So every house which is built in this city must have 2 subterranean spaces. Must have a cistern to store water and a cellar to store food. From the rock removed to excavate these subterranean spaces, you have enough stone to build the house above. How's that for sustainability? The knights brought over great architects over the years that they were there till the 18th century. Architects like Bonamici, architects like Carapecchia, who all built palaces and churches which are still there today and which are definitely on an itinerary to be visited. And of course there were a lot of Maltese architects as well, like Thomas Dingley, like Lorenzo Gaffar, who all created absolute masterpieces in the way the stone was used. You see, Malta has always been a fortress and a sanctuary. A fortress against Islam and a sanctuary because it's religious. The number of churches actually speaks for that. So the glory of the period of the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem is an absolute perfect architectural choreography to be visited. The vernacular architecture of Malta is a wonderful lesson in the maximum utilization of minimal resources. The wonderful things about a vernacular architecture is the tradition. So here we have buildings which are completely made out of this one available building material, which is stone. The foundation is rock, the walls are stone, the ceiling is stone, so you find ingenious methodologies to span, because stone is very strong in compression but very weak in tension, which makes it very difficult to create large spans. But the vernacular offers wonderful, absolutely wonderful lessons which should be learnt. And that is where the spirit of place, apart from the classical architecture, or architecture with a capital A, it's what Bernard Rudowski had referred to as architecture without architects, but sometimes more successful than the architecture produced by architects. To come back to the sort of periodical systemization, we have the British period, and with the British period we had architects like Scamp, who did the Anglican Cathedral. And we had the Opera House, built by Barry, but which was destroyed during World War II. We had Maltese architects like Emanuel Galizia, mostly noted for his funerary architecture of the cemetery of the Adolorata. But then there was the Second World War, which destroyed a lot of Malta. One of the most interesting and fascinating periods for Malta was obviously the decade of the 60s, for a number of reasons. One was the zeitgeist of the age, where of course we had new musicians with Elvis Presley, the Beatles, and classical music, Stockhausen, John Cage. Then of course the student riots. But there was a great period when, for the first time, people forgot the Second World War and the future looked good. And it was enthusiastic. That reached Malta. 1964, we had independence. And with that, there was a surge for a search to create something which somehow had its roots and mnemonic retentions in the past of Malta, with all its history and all its many layers over thousands of years. But then there was something else, which not a lot of people actually acknowledge. There were a number of visitors who came to Malta, people of immense international stature, people like Desmond Morris, Ernie Bradford, Basil Spence, who was the architect for Coventry Cathedral, Victor Passmore, who was probably the most important abstract artist from Britain, and Nicholas Montserrat. So a number of people. And I was extremely lucky. I was architect to all of them. I was in my 20s, and so that was absolutely amazing. And the wonderful thing was that I became very, very close friends with a number of these people. At the end, you become what you behold, as William Blake says, and it's what you assimilate which makes you what you are. And I remain ever grateful to these particular people. They probably come from the Arab period of Malta. It's also a result of the society, because it was a wonderful place, but it's an in-between place. You're neither out and you're not even in. It's like a threshold space. And threshold spaces are always very interesting, because the people outside could not view the person inside, but the person inside could view what was going on the outside, which is perfect for a very close-knit society. And a close-knit society by its own nature, and it's close-knit society because obviously the fear of invasion, also the climatic conditions. Remember that the architecture of the vernacular architecture of Malta, the architecture without architects, is very much a restricted, private-oriented series of buildings, both for climatic reasons, both for social reasons. And you know the wonderful thing about a Maltese townscape is, I said that Malta was a meeting place of north and south as the center of the Mediterranean. If you look at a Maltese typical townscape, you've got the cube houses, which come from the south, and in the middle you've got this almost orgasmic explosion of the Baroque dome, which obviously is Italian and came with the advent of the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem. And it is this amalgamation of these two very typical typologies which create the meeting points. And you only find them in Malta. Once you go to Sicily, you start getting the inclined roofs. If you go to Libya or North Africa, you're not going to obviously find the Christian church. So you have this wonderful amalgamation. One of the greatest and oldest definitions of architecture is by the Roman architect Vitruvius. Vitruvius had said that architecture is about utility, it's about being done in the complete way where it is safe, commodity, firmness, and delight. Now, commodity and firmness do not necessarily produce architecture, they could produce construction. What lifts that construction to the realm of architecture is delight. Now, whether delight is beauty or whether delight is, but whatever it is what I like to refer to as the wow factor. When you walk into a building, if you walk into St. John's Co-Cathedral, it's not only the architecture of Girolamo Cassar, which is very sparse, but it's the overlay of paintings by Mattia Preti. And of course the two Caravaggios as a nice little annex on the right-hand side. There is no doubt that you feel that that architecture is doing something to you. It is about the geometry of the space influencing the geometry of the mind. Architecture and space are mood manipulative. There's no doubt about it that architecture can make you feel happy, can make you feel uncomfortable, which is why I'm particularly interested in sacred architecture. Sacred architecture takes you to a step even beyond the beauty. You are measuring against the immeasurable. And then there, it's about silence. And silence is, I think, one of the most important elements in everything in life. But most of all, the void, the space between the building, is perhaps sometimes more important than the building itself. And ultimately, it is the interior of the building. The space is like a wine vessel. It's the vessel itself might be very beautiful, but its real content is what lies within. Actually, I have a theory which comes from Mother Teresa's saying. Mother Teresa says, "It is not so important what you do, but how much love you put into the doing." And I have a theory that the energy and the love and the commitment which an architect or an artist puts into his work is actually transformed into the work, and somehow or other, when you enter a building, you feel that energy sent played back to you. And you will not get it in a commercial building. You will get it in a building which is done with love. One of my favorite authors is Jorge Luis Borges, the Argentinian, who was blind, who incidentally said a wonderful thing, because he was asked, but if you're blind, why do you travel? He said, I travel because it is more important to feel a place than to see it, which I've always thought was a wonderful thing about the spirit of place. Jorge Luis Borges has this wonderful phrase where he says, my business is to weave dreams. And I've often thought that in architecture, perhaps architects should remember that. My own favorite quote comes from the playwright Tennessee Williams. I don't want reality, I want magic. I think architects at that time, as I do today, believe that the architect is not only the designer of the future, but also the defender of the past. I think that is extremely important. So building in certain areas requires very good manners. And on the whole, architects are arrogant people. So perhaps it's difficult, but it is important that you listen to the site, listen to the voices of the site, read the memories of the site, and they will tell you whether you need to produce a building which in fact is an emphatic building or the building which sings in the chorus. You don't always have to have a Pavarotti doing a high C, but sometimes you need to sing in the choir. Each particular project requires its own solution. The Opera House was, of course, destroyed in the Second World War. There was a competition in the 50s, ill-fated. Then there was another competition in 87, which I won, and nothing happened because it was decided that the brief was badly written, so they stopped the whole thing. Then there was another competition, which I won again, and then there was a change of government, and I was ruled out, and the new government produced another competition, and much to their annoyance, I won that again. And so 3 competitions later, no building, and the only part of the whole project was the rehabilitation of St. James Cavalier as an art centre. It was fascinating because one was trying to rehabilitate a building which had been designed specifically to keep people out. It was a gun platform with guns on the roof to defend against the oncoming enemy from the land side, as opposed to the bastions which defended from the sea. So here you have a building which basically says keep out, and now you want to change that without destroying its spirit into something which welcomes people. So I thought about an architecture of layering. So you have the layer of the original building, which was probably by Laparelli and continued by Girolamo Cassar. So you read what the Knights of the Order of St. John of Jerusalem did in that building. Then you had the British overlay when they built cisterns and things, so you need to read that as well. And you also need to read my own particular interventions, which never touched the walls. They were really installations. So visually you could almost pick them out. But the important thing there was that architecture became a verb, no longer a noun, because the building recounted its own story. There was a legibility. As you walked through the building, you could read its history. You could read its mnemonic residues. And that, in a way, is, if an architecture can tell a story, it is far more interesting than just a building which has no narrative to recount. There's a touching story to it. When I came back from my studies and work period in Geoponte, because I had passed the test and been accepted to work in the studio and then studied at the Polytechnic in Milan, my father had said, look, well done, you've achieved it, and congratulations, and I'm going to give you a present. I'm not going to give you money, and I'm not going to give you an object. But 2 weeks ago, I got a commission to design a church for the little village of Manicata. It's yours. And regretfully, he never saw the building completed because he died in the process. It took 12 years to build. It's amazing because it was almost a medieval concept. The people who actually built the church couldn't read, didn't know how to decipher a plan. And when I went up with the drawings, a week later, I asked the farmer over there, the chief sort of farmer, and I said, where are the drawings? He said, very nice, I framed them. He said, well, they're not exactly meant to be framed, they're sort of means to an end. You know, they're a language which the architect writes, a script which the architect puts on paper for other people to read and be able to manifest the building. He said, yes, but, you know, between you and I, nobody reads here. We're illiterate. So I had to go up in a very medieval way, saying, you put up this wall, and when you get over here, you call me and I'll come and I'll tell you how to continue. So I often used to tell my students, once in your lifetime, make a building with your hands. It's completely different. Because an architect makes a series of drawings, the contractor makes the building. But if you make a building with your hands, it's yours, it belongs to you. The computer gives us a lot of information, but very little knowledge. So it was a 12-year experience. And it was my first building. Architecture is the least permanent of all the arts. Nobody would touch a painting, nobody would touch a sculpture, nobody would add lines to a poem or verses to a book. But the moment you hand a piece of architecture over to the client, it's no longer yours, and it's up to the client to decide whether he wants to open windows, change colors. No, that's more painful than if it's actually demolished, because then there remains the possibility that people still associate my name with a building which in fact has been changed. I think in Malta it comes basically because of the architecture which has survived. Of course, it's the architecture of Valletta, the bastions, the fortresses, the churches, and those are the buildings which do survive, because those are almost untouchable. But for the ordinary run-of-the-mill architecture, the future is dangerous. You know, I don't know what will remain of my buildings, but then is it that important? I don't know. I've always documented my buildings at the very early stages, so I've more or less got a complete documentation of all the buildings I've done. But you know, one of the extraordinary things with these renderings, which are so accurate today, that while real and manifest architecture is likely to change, the rendering is there exactly as it was, and that is permanent. So virtual reality, in fact, outlives reality itself, which is true amongst all other things. You know, the virtual world is taking over from the real world, and not always a very positive assessment to make. The bridge between mind and paper is still best crossed by the hand. You need to be able to convey what's in your mind onto paper by the use of your hand. And sketching leads you somewhere else. call it chance, call it God, I don't know. But sometimes when you're sketching, you say, oh, yes, that's better. That's a route I can follow. I can move this way or I can move that way. I always believe at the end, it's how you look at life and what life offers you. Because, people say you're successful, yes, but success is not a destination, it's a journey. And when people ask me, what is your best building? Well, I hopefully say it's the next one. Hopefully one aspires to put up a building which sings. I don't know if I've succeeded. It's not for me to say if I've succeeded or not.